It's a chronic brain disease. An addiction to drugs or alcohol is a problem for approximately 30 million people in the United States. That's almost 1 out of 8 Americans living with some form of addiction. And it's on the rise. We'll learn why we're so addicted and how we can recover. Next on Living Smart. Welcome to Living Smart, the show designed to help you get the most out of life. How did Derek Steele go from addict to recovered millionaire? It all started with parents who made bad choices and a young man who found the courage to overcome his predicament. Here's his story.
Do you know what an addict looks like? When most kids were learning to ride their bikes, I was learning how to get drunk. At 8, it was my first taste of tequila. At 10, it was my first joint. At 13, my first hit of acid. At 14, the first time I tried coke. At 15, well, what's there to remember? I don't have a single photograph for the rest of my teenage years. My memories aren't typical. I traded school dances for juvenile detention, football games for armed robbery. Instead of making friends, I spent every waking moment trying to figure out how to get high or drunk, just to fill the void. Imagine losing 25% of your body weight in 2 months. Imagine taking Benadryl to stop the allergic reaction to the coke in your system. Imagine spending 2 days alone in a dark apartment, smoking crack, reopening the blisters on your already burned lips and hands, unable to put the pipe down. Imagine the hopelessness of knowing within a year you'd be in jail or dead. The nightmare ended on March 17th, 1993. By the grace of God, I checked into a treatment center and committed to changing my life. Within a year, I was sober and a partner in a successful construction company. In 1997, I co-founded a software company that would go on to gross over $5 million a year. By 1999, I was married to my wife, Becky, and started my family. I continued to find success, and by the age of 35, I'd become a multimillionaire. More importantly, I stayed sober and became a loving husband and father. Addict at 10 isn't just a gritty tell-all. For me, it's the final step in treatment, an attempt to help others. It's a story of second chances and third chances and as many as it takes to get it right.
You started doing drugs at 8. Mm-hmm. Why so early?
Really, the family that I was surrounded by, and it wasn't a conscious, I want to change the way I feel experience. It was more about experimentation, and all the adults were drinking, and I wanted to be a part of the group. So alcohol was the first thing that I tried at 8 years old.
What role did your parents play in all of this?
I think there's several answers to that, or pieces to it. Primarily, it was that I grew up in a family where there was a lot of drinking, so I was exposed to it, and it was very acceptable. The other piece is that a lot of my emotional needs and my spiritual needs were not being met, and because of that, there was turmoil going on. And so I think those were probably the two biggest factors that I could describe.
I did find very disturbing, though, in your life story, how your parents would laugh that you were drunk, which is not normal. But right. But it happens in families. So we'll talk about that later. Let's say I'm a teacher or I'm an adult, and I see you, and you come from parents who don't really care what's going on, or don't understand what's going on. But I'm an adult, and I see that you're an addict and you're a child. What can I do as an adult or as a teacher to help you?
There's two ways to go about it. One is, I would say, a direct method. So if you have a relationship with that person, or it's appropriate to listen to them and to befriend them, if you will, to give them support. And then if that's not an appropriate way to address it, then there's so many resources these days, especially within schools, with school counselors and social workers and things of that nature, which there really wasn't a lot of that when I was in grade school.
Contributing factors to addiction at an early age, what are they?
The family of origin component, environment. There is definitely quite a bit of research that shows that there is a genetic component to this. It's not true in every case, but there's predispositions. So that's a factor as well.
and then really your environment that you grow up in, and ultimately substance abuse and addiction, their core is in pain avoidance. So many times what you'll find with addicts and alcoholics is that there's been some sort of trauma that's gone on, or multiple cases of trauma, and that person is seeking to relieve pain.
Are these factors consistent in addiction in general?
Yes and no. I mean, there's a lot of commonality, but you can't just say X, Y, and Z is going to equal an addict. It just doesn't work that way. It's not that simple. There's environmental aspects in your surroundings. There's internal aspects that are going on, which are more, physiological or biological, psychological components, and everybody has their own, formula as to what's going on.
How widespread is substance abuse in teens today? I mean, do we have statistics? Do we really know what's going on with our teenagers?
About 1 in 12 becomes an addict. Now, when we say addict, it's drugs, it's alcohol, and then when you bring in process addictions, behavioral addictions, which are gambling and sex and things of that nature, then the number goes up to greater than 1 in 12. But just for substance abuse, it's 1 in 12.
You shared that you're concerned about our war on drugs in America, that for years we have invested money in the wrong areas. Tell me about that, and what do we need to be thinking about if we really want to deal with addiction in America?
What's happened is that the government has continued to allocate 75% of the funds to law enforcement and about 25% of their funds to treatment and research. And so while they say that they're changing this and turning into a public health issue, the money hasn't changed yet, so that's concerning. And then the other issue is that this problem doesn't have anything to do with Mexico or drugs coming across the border. This problem has to do with our homes and our communities and our children and our citizens. That's where it's going to be solved. And so I think that taking the war to Mexico, we need to be fighting the battle at home.
Maybe investing that money in here and
Absolutely.
treatment programs. Let's talk, because in your book you talk about, what it feels like to be an addict. A lot of people don't understand what goes in your heart, your mind, and your soul when you're an addict. Share some of that with us.
And I try in the book to convey many of these points to bring people in a first-person experience with addiction and alcoholism, and two things that I identified that are as close as I can get. One is coffee drinkers. They wake up in the morning, I'm a coffee drinker.
Me too.
It's the first thing that I think about. Get me my cup of coffee, then I can deal with life. So take that and multiply it times 100. That I got to get my first cup of coffee.
That craving.
That you need it. It's a part of your functioning, and you continue to think about it or obsess on it. And the other would be smoking. Anybody that's ever smoked has experienced cravings and obsession if you're, an actual, heavy smoker. And I still think take that and multiply it times some factor, because that's not mind-altering or mood-altering, which adds another dimension to addiction and alcoholism.
How hard was it for you to get sober? What was the catalyst for you?
Well, I had to hit a point to where I became willing, to where the pain of what I was doing became greater than the perceived pain of change. And I say perceived because many times we think that doing something different is going to be so much harder. So I had to reach that point. When I reached that point, then I became willing to do what I had to do, which there's quite a few things that had to be done. But to get to the point to where I was really ready, and everybody has to reach that place, and it doesn't look the same for everybody.
Right, everybody's different.
Everybody's different.
Great myth, though, is that you have to hit bottom to get help. I don't know where we got that myth, but it's an ongoing myth.
Sure.
And it's kind of dangerous, isn't it?
I think it is. There's some truth. Most great myths have some truth to them. The truth is that people have to get to the point to where they're ready to change. But a catalyst for change can come from the outside in the form of interventions where that catalyst is brought from the outside. Sometimes it has to come from that person themselves and the position that they're in.
Let's talk about intervention, because there's a show about it, and I think it's a great idea. Do you think that really works, and did that work for you?
I wasn't intervened upon.
Exactly, you weren't intervened.
Well,
I
guess
it worked
the courts.
For you. The courts intervened
right.
for you. It was like a big wake-up call. But I mean, intervention, when you have people who love you say, do you really think that people around you don't know what's going on with you when you're an addict?
It's a part of the denial system.
Okay.
So, yes.
So I think it's important then to if you can get people around that person to intervene, it does seem to work.
It creates, you're trying to create that place where the person feels
comfortable.
Pain about what they're doing and is willing to examine change.
The hardest part for you, one day you make a decision at age 20, this is it, I'm going to get help. And you do get help. But then this is an ongoing problem for addicts, and that's relapse.
Right.
What do you have to do to get sober? What did you have to do to get sober and to remain sober?
Right. I went through a process of detox, a 30-day inpatient treatment, joining a 12-step program, extensive therapy, developing my spiritual life and dealing with my emotional and spiritual issues, which I believe are at the core of all addictions. And so, obviously, the book describes in great detail all of those things, but I had to hit every area of my life with support.
Right. You needed emotional support, physical support, all kinds of support. Does everybody follow the recovery process the same way? I mean, obviously, everybody's different, but is the recovery sort of like, you got to do the 30-day detox, and then you have to have a spiritual component? What do you think about that? Is that for everybody?
Everybody doesn't follow the same process.
Okay.
As far as treatment or, doing these certain things. What I do think is true and consistent with all of us is that we have a physical self, an emotional self, and a spiritual self.
Reality.
Regardless of your religion or anything of that nature. And so I think all of us have to deal with mind, body, spirit. I don't think that you can be one-sided in your approach to dealing with this because it affects all areas of our 3 parts of ourself. So I think that everybody has to deal with their physical, their emotional, and their spiritual selves and get healing in those areas.
You and I talked a little bit about the science of addiction and how there are vaccines now, or there will be, but that doesn't deal with the emotional, spiritual side of it. It just deals with the scientific, which is important, but you need to deal with these other sides as well. In your book, and I read about your book, and I thought this was very, very interesting. You spent a lot of time talking about how difficult it was for you to stay sober.
Right.
Tell me more about that.
For probably the first 180 days, I would say were very difficult, and it got progressively easier over time. But the first 120 days, it was a daily battle, and then probably the next 120 days, maybe I would have to fight the battle during periods in the day. And then after about 180 days is really when it got much easier. And then for the last 17 plus years, staying sober is as easy as breathing. I mean, it's just what I do. But
it was very interesting in your book when you talk about, everything was great. It sounded like everything was going great. And then one day you said, I got to go to Mexico and I got to get plastered and I got to get drunk. And somehow something told you, no, you can't do this. What happened?
Well, let me give a little preface to that. How at 15 years sober, I reached the point where I thought it was a good idea to drink again. And what had happened is I had not been caring for myself emotionally and spiritually, and so I got to a point to where I was experiencing a lot of emotional turmoil, and I just wanted it to go away. So what I did yesterday is not going to help me today. So it's each day I have to wake up and make sure I'm taking care of myself. And so that's what happened. And the grace of God, I actually picked up the phone, reached out for help, and didn't reach out for a bottle.
That's excellent. It's very important for people to know what are some of the most successful adolescent treatment programs out there in America. And obviously it's your opinion, but
sure.
What are some of the advice that you would give?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say programs, but I would say a model.
Models, okay.
The model for treatment is that we've, really pioneered here in Houston is an adolescent peer group model. And what that is where we take a young person, we pull them from their environment and put them into an after-school program where they're surrounded by kids that are in recovery, because teens listen to teens.
Right.
And so we give them a group whereby they can associate, and it's cool and it's fun, and they can see that being sober and living this new lifestyle is good for them. And in addition to that, we have a sober high school here in Houston, which is phenomenal. So even during the day, they can be surrounded by sobriety and recovery and kids in the program. And then we also involve the family heavily. So parents will come to group 2 times a week. So it's got to be a family component that's being handled. That model is highly, highly effective, and also making sure that adolescents are being treated in an adolescent program, not in an adult program, because they're very different. Anybody that has kids knows just how different they are. So.
And they can look at our website to see the places they can go around the country to get help. Let's talk about, you talked about peer review, and I think that is so important, because if I'm a parent and I'm trying to get my kid to not do drugs and to do the right thing, but all his friends are doing drugs, or they're doing some sort of, drug, how do you as a parent stop that influence from their peers? I mean, it's so difficult.
Very difficult. And sometimes you have to just pull them out of the environment.
Okay.
And that's a part of being decisive in your actions. And not allowing, we all want to be friends with our kids.
Right.
But we're there to be parents.
Right. Sometimes you can't be their friend. You need to
have
be
to make
their
the hard
parent.
decisions.
You need to discipline. Let's talk about adult programs, successful adult programs, or models.
Well, it operates similarly. If you look at 12-step programs, it's designed around a support group and peer influence. It obviously has a spiritual and emotional component, but it's centered around this peer environment. And so that's very, very successful as well.
And that's sort of an example is AA.
Sure.
Correct.
Sure.
Let's talk about, because this is really important for parents to get the warning signs. Sometimes we're too busy, we have too much work to do. What are some of the warning signs that parents can look at in their children to make sure that they're not getting involved with drugs? And the first one is abnormal behavior. What does that mean, abnormal behavior?
Well, as a parent, the expectation is that you're fairly in tune with your child's patterns as they develop. And so when you see abnormal behaviors, don't dismiss it. It doesn't hurt to investigate. And parents get in denial just as much as, addicts do.
It seems easier to be in denial,
well,
doesn't it?
It is.
It seems, but
of course, we don't have to deal with it,
Exactly.
So denial is not the easier way long term. So don't dismiss any abnormal behaviors and take the time to investigate.
Ask questions, right. Change in school performance.
Right. That's a big one, and it's typically pretty obvious to see. Most of the time you're going to get notified by the school. Once again, if you're in tune with what's happening with what's going on in your child's life and you see changes, school performance is a really good indicator.
And we just talked about peers.
Right.
Change in friends.
Yes, absolutely. If they had a group of friends before that fit a mold that you were comfortable with, and while they were with that group, their behavior and their performance was good, and then you see a shift in their peer group, and all of a sudden you're seeing abnormal behaviors or performance at school or in certain things is not in line with what you think it should be, then that's a pretty good indicator that that group is having a negative influence.
Physical and emotional changes.
Right. And kids have some, they're going through, teenagers especially are going through some changes in that period and can get a little crazy, if you will.
Never.
So, no, not teens. So, this one is a little bit harder to see, but once again, you just have to be in tune with what seems to be within your range of, healthy behaviors associated with somebody of that age, and we're looking for the bouncing out of ranges.
Okay. Genetic predisposition, you talked a little bit about that at the top of the show. That's another thing to look at.
Absolutely. If alcoholism and addiction runs in the family, there's enough research to indicate that there are genetic factors. It's not to say that if your parent was an alcoholic, then you're going to be an alcoholic, but there are predispositions. So if you know that that's something that runs in the family, then you should be extra vigilant in keeping an eye out for it.
Same with co-occurring mental health issues.
Absolutely, absolutely. Typically what you'll find is that most adolescents struggling with addiction are dual diagnosis. So if they struggle with depression and things of that nature. So if you've got some mental or emotional issues outside of addiction, then typically addiction is readily comes into those situations.
Absolutely. To numb the pain usually,
Absolutely.
Right? Obsession with drug-using culture.
Right. Yes, and that's a pretty easy one to identify.
Right.
Back when I was growing up, Scarface was the movie back then, which I was completely obsessed with. And so an unhealthy obsession. Obviously, whatever we're interested in, I'm interested in golf. I like golf, so I watch the Golf Channel, okay? Well, if I'm interested in drugs and alcohol and high-risk behaviors, then a lot of times that'll be displayed in the things that I'm watching or that I'm focusing on. So it's typically a good indicator of where my interests lie as to what I'm watching and the things that I'm doing.
Right. Now, feedback you get from other parents. Sometimes other parents get involved and tell you, hey, I noticed some strange things about your kid. Not usual because parents don't like to meddle. But
to meddle, yeah. Once again, it's about listening and not being in denial and not just dismissing things. If you find pot in your teenager's drawer, I can guarantee you they're not holding it for a friend. Don't dismiss that behavior. Pretty simple, example.
Right.
But you have to be in tune and watching for the signs.
Missing money.
Oh yeah,
that's a big one.
Big indicator. And I'll add to that, watching your medicine cabinet. The new drug dealer of our society today is the medicine cabinet. So the prescription pill epidemic, absolutely.
Or any prescription drugs.
Any prescription drugs that are mind-altering. So watch your medicine cabinet and see, really it should be locked up. Ultimately, those things should be locked up.
Okay, so let's say my kid has one of those, 10 or 2 of those. What's the next step?
The next step is to educate yourself. There's tons of resources out there. And so really learn what you're dealing with. Get an assessment. Find a professional and get an assessment. Urine analysis. Don't be afraid that if you see some things going on that concern you, to have your child take a drug test.
Okay.
Best case scenario, they pass it, great. So take decisive action, but I'd say educate and then go from there to figure out what the professionals in your community can help you as far as a plan of action.
What do you think today is the most promising in treatment?
Promising in treatment? I think that these days there is really a multifaceted approach, and I think that our society and treatment professionals have really understood that it's not just a single facet in addiction. And so there's a lot of great stuff out there and more than we can go into now. But I think ultimately people are learning that, we have to treat the family, we have to treat the individual. There's a lot of things that have to be done. So I wouldn't say that there's any one particular thing, but I think it's the attitude towards treatment that's improved.
And it's sort of the environmental aspect, the spiritual aspect, the physical aspect, and the emotional. You can't just say, stop selling the drugs. You got to deal with all these other issues. Well, it's the whole person. If we're going to sum up the show, what are the 3 most important things to remember about addiction?
Well, I think we've covered some of them, so I'd like to just reiterate them. First is awareness. You have to be aware. You have to stay out of denial so that you can focus on reality and be able to make decisions based on reality. Take decisive action. This is not something that you want to fool around with and just see if it gets better. And then the third, I'd say, is hope. We have to be very hopeful in this because many times in the journey of recovery, there's stumbling, and sometimes people can get discouraged. So stay
hopeful. Right, because relapse is very common.
Relapse is common.
Most people do relapse, correct?
Absolutely.
You didn't.
I didn't.
But the most common thing is to see relapse.
Absolutely.
Like only 90% or it's very high. How do you know you're living smart?
I know I'm living smart when I'm looking at all the areas of my life and focusing on how I can be aware and improve. My physical self, my spiritual self, my emotional self, financial self, and the relational self. And so trying to balance each of those and to be healthy, which is easier said than done. It's very easy to get wrapped into work or our financial self, and other parts of us become unhealthy. So for me, focusing on all those areas and trying to maintain each of those to the best of my ability, and it's never ever perfect. And
I'm just curious, what was the hardest part of all of this journey for you?
I would have to say my spiritual self, and really
finding that within yourself.
Finding that, and then growing that side of myself, and then also realizing that that's the most important part of me. Because my spiritual health translates to my emotional health, and my emotional health then translates to my relational health with other people. Mm-hmm. So it's all interconnected.
Thank you so much, Derek Steele.
Appreciate
it. Great book, and congratulations on what you've done. And to learn more about addiction and prevention, go to our website. There you'll find a complete resource list. You can also email us or call us with your comments at 713-743-8513. And that's our show for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember to live smart. I'm Patricia Gras. Have a healthy week. Thanks.
For a transcript of this program, send $6.95 to the address on your screen. Please include the name of the guest.